Welcome to the Dynamics of Everyday Life, where we demystify some tricky concepts and get to know ourselves a little bit better. Welcome back to the Dynamics of Everyday Life. Normally, my episodes are what is known as evergreen. That is, they don't relate to any particular time of year. This is a deliberate decision by me, as it means that the content shouldn't date. Whenever you find the podcast and decide to listen, nothing that I'm talking about should be time dependent. However, there are going to be a couple of times in the year when an opportunity pops up that is just too good to miss. Halloween is one of them, as when better to talk about ghosting than Halloween? On a side note though, I do love Halloween as a parent. It is very easy for a quick parenting win. When my children were small, the expectations were particularly low. I dressed them up in an outfit from Tesco or Amazon, probably bought the day before, walked them around for a couple of hours, harassing the neighbours for sweets, and boom, job done. And they remember it all year. It's much less work required than Christmas or birthdays. No decorations, no cards, no school events for years beforehand. And it still had a lasting impact for them. But enough of my parenting shortcuts. This isn't a parenting podcast. There are plenty of people out there who do that much better than I could do. What we're talking about today is the far less fun phenomena of ghosting. And whilst this is often talked about in terms of relationships, it also occurs in friendships and work scenarios. So what is ghosting? Ghosting is where you get cut off from all forms of communication. No matter how much you reach out to the other person, you are not going to get a response. There's absolute radio silence. Now, today we rely on technology to communicate much more, so it's actually a lot easier to ghost people than to deal with the situation at hand, especially as not everyone's going to have had good emotional education or have developed their awareness. Let's think back to looking at narcissism over some of our more recent previous episodes, and some people feel that their emotions are more important than other people's, and so they just don't care that they might be hurting other people's feelings. As long as they're okay, then that's fine. So why do people ghost, and how can we think about this from a psychodynamic perspective? It won't be a surprise for you to learn that we want to avoid anxiety at all costs. We will do absolutely anything we can to avoid those anxious feelings. We really don't want to get involved in difficult conversations. Difficult conversations are going to provoke the anxiety that we want to avoid, so we'll do everything that we can to get around this. We also don't want to feel any blame or responsibility for our thoughts or actions. So if we can stop thinking about it, if we can cut it dead in our minds, if it just doesn't exist to us, then we're not actually having to take blame or responsibility because it hasn't happened. We haven't had a difficult conversation. We haven't said something to somebody that they might have been upset by. So if it hasn't happened, then we don't need to think about it. All this is leading to is that it's too much for us to bear. So guess what? Out come the defence mechanisms. Time to get your bingo cards ready. I bet if you were going to put money on any one defence mechanism being involved in ghosting, you would put it on denial. It's absolutely a huge defence mechanism that's involved in ghosting. We don't want to see what might be going on for us. We don't want to see that we might have to have a really difficult conversation. So guess what? The easiest thing for us to do is to deny that it exists, to deny that the problem exists. We can just shut it away in a box, tie a ribbon around it and move on as if nothing happened. We don't want the conflict that's going to arise from us having that anxiety-inducing conversation. We want to be as far away from it as possible, so we're going to deny that it's even a factor in our lives. We've got projection as well. What we do instead here is we decide that somebody else's behaviour is bad, that somebody else has these difficult feelings, that something is going on for somebody else, and that's why we're not speaking to them. It's a lot easier than acknowledging that within ourselves, that's where the problem resides. We've got regression. We don't often talk about this one on the podcast, but I think regression is one here that's actually incredibly relevant. So just to check in with everyone, regression is where we return to an earlier state of development. A really good example here is, remember when you were small or even sometimes a teenager and that you had an argument with somebody at school and you didn't speak to them? Well, guess what? How different is ghosting to that level of behaviour? It's just the same as when you decided you didn't like somebody at school and sent them to Coventry. I don't even know if we still talk about that expression, but it was one very much when I was growing up. If you sent someone to Coventry, then you weren't talking to them. I'm not actually sure what Coventry did to anyone to make it a bad place to be sent there, but that's what happened. And what we're talking about here is that state of regression where we're doing exactly what we did when we were a teenager. We're not talking to people. You're not talking to someone, you can pretend the problem doesn't exist. We've also got rationalisation. Now, this is where we construct reasons as to why something's okay. So what we're doing here is we're making excuses for why we've ghosted someone to stop ourselves from feeling bad that we've actually done it. If we can tell ourselves that actually it's the right thing to do, it's a good thing to do, then guess what? We feel okay about it. We've got reaction formation. This is where we do the opposite from what we really believe or want. So if you have incredibly strong feelings for someone, but are concerned that these might not be reciprocated, then to save yourself the stress of being rejected, you tell yourself that you don't like them and you stop all contact. Again, it feels like there are elements of regression in here as well, because it feels quite a little bit like being in the schoolyard. So what should you do if you've been ghosted? Now, first of all, don't be too hard on yourself. Our initial response is to think that we've done something wrong. And maybe we have. I'm not using this as a get out of jail free card for everything. But as my beloved friend Steve always used to say, if you can't think of anything that you've done wrong, then the chances are that you haven't. Another thing to consider is the likelihood that this is a part of a pattern of behaviour. If someone's done it to you, then it's extraordinarily likely that they've done it to someone else. This might not make it feel any less painful, but it can help you to realise that this isn't as personal as it feels. I'd encourage you to take your time and mend your bruises. We can all be a bit Disney-fied about this. We can all be a bit kind of like, fall down 7 times and get up 8. But the truth is that it hurts, and it needs to be acknowledged that it hurts, because if you don't acknowledge that it hurts, you're never going to move through it. The other point that I think is extremely important is that it's actually incredibly rude to ghost someone. And if someone has done it to you, then it says more about them and how they feel about the relationship and friendship than it does about you. Several years ago, I was ghosted by someone who I actually considered to be a friend of many years. And I honestly don't know what I did or I said. And I never will. But I know that generally I'm a good person, and I've never set out to do anything that would hurt anyone. So her behaviour said more about her ability to communicate and the lack of investment she had in the friendship than it did about me. After much mulling it over and ruminating, I've decided that the best thing that I can do is just let it go, because I'll never know what actually happened. And this ties in with my last point on what we should do if we've been ghosted, is to try and emotionally let them go in your mind. As human beings, we often want closure, but realistically, they've given it to you by behaving this way. Do I want someone in my life who thinks it's okay to treat people? And I mean anyone at this point, not just me. Well, no thank you. Now, what should you do if you're tempted to ghost someone? Let's not lie, it does happen. I'd encourage you to stop and think about what might be going on for you. I'm not asking you to question whether or not you want the relationship to continue. That's absolutely your choice. However, you never know when you might need to connect with someone later on in your life. Maya Angelou says that people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. That's such an important thing for us to consider when we're communicating with people. And we all need to end relationships from time to time, for whatever reason. Doing it with grace and dignity can make the world of difference. It might be painful in the short term, but I promise you in the long run you'll feel better for it. Now, there's a counterpoint to this. Some people do warrant being ghosted. If you've been in an abusive relationship or you've had to deal with a narcissist, then ghosting might be the best way forward. This is a conscious, active choice though, and it's for your mental health, which is very different from avoiding things. My invitation for you this week is have a think about where in your life you've been ghosted and how you responded. Did you make up a narrative around this? Did it sit with you for months? How can you let go of the ghost? It's very unlikely that you're going to be able to unmask it and find the true culprit. Life is not an episode of Scooby-Doo. However, have a think about how you can assign it to its true owner. So that's the person who did the ghosting. And additionally, if you've ghosted someone, have a think about whether you were doing it to protect your mental health or whether it was to make life easier for you in the long run. Looking at ourselves at this level can be challenging and unnerving as we develop our awareness, so I'd always encourage that you do this at your own speed. If you feel you need some extra help around this, then I've put together a PDF resource sheet and you can find the link for this in the show notes. If you'd like to have a chat with me about psychodynamics or whether I'm the right coach, supervisor or mentor for you, then click on the link that's also in the show notes. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Dynamics of Everyday Life. Please hit the follow button for future episodes and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. You can follow me on Instagram at The Dynamics of Everyday Life or find me on LinkedIn at Julia Rogers. I'd love to hear from you and hear your thoughts on dynamics. The Dynamics of Everyday Life is brought to you by Coaching 42 and the fabulous team at the Podcast Boutique.